Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Josephine Loren here with Mary Knight, filmmaker, author, and member of the Incest Aware Alliance. The Alliance is an organization of individuals and other organizations that are working to help amplify the anti-incest movement by improving methods of incest prevention, intervention, recovery, and justice. Mary, thanks so much for being with us. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Name's Mary Knight, and I am the author of this book, My Life Now, Essays by a Child Sex Trafficking Survivor. I'm also a filmmaker. I've gone back to my profession as a social worker, so I'm also a psychotherapist. Mhm.
I love it. So it is Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month, as well as Child Abuse Prevention Month. For this month, Incest Aware partnered with a number of organizations, including yours, to launch the True Memories campaign, which is really highlighting the prevalence of recovered memory or delayed recall or dissociative amnesia. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that is?
All those words do describe it. Some people say repressed memory or forgotten memory, but basically it's when the trauma is so bad that your mind has to find another place to store it, so it's not in conscious memory all the time, so that you can live your life and do the things necessary for survival. For me, my abuse was by my parents and other people, but if I had constantly remembered how abusive my parents were, I would have died. I was dependent on them, and I would have been unwilling to depend on them. People who have been abused in the extreme ways, like I have, ritualistic abuse and child sex trafficking, often don't remember the abuse until adulthood.
My question is delayed memory just applied to children or sexual abuse survivors, or are there other people who experience delayed recall or recovered memory as well?
There's others. Another example would be someone who was 18 and a private in the military, and a commanding officer raped her. She didn't feel safe telling what happened, and at that time in our military, you had to go to your commanding officer if you were raped, but she didn't recall it for many years. Many other examples. I'm interviewing people who have recovered memories, and it could be recovered memory of anything. One of the people I asked to be on camera so I could do a clip of her recovered memory, she's had 2 good parents, and she started having dreams when she was adult of being in this room as a little girl, and everyone was talking weird. She didn't understand why she was having that, and she told her mom, and her mom looked at her and said, "Well, don't you remember?" She had been in speech therapy when she was young. She was remembering being in speech therapy, not highly traumatic, but she did recover a memory of it, and it's a confirmed memory. Sometimes it's not extremely traumatic, but it was definitely confirmed because when her mom said that, she said, "Oh, yeah, I remember now."
So you recovered your memories, and then what inspired you to use various art mediums to express your story? You know, you've written a book now, you've created 2 films, you have a YouTube channel, you've given a number of talks and been interviewed.
I wanted to help other survivors. I knew I wanted to help other survivors. So in 2013, I was wanting to make a personal documentary. I was also wanting to write a memoir. So I was taking classes at a film school on documentary making. I was also applying for an MFA program for creative writing, creative nonfiction. I was told by someone on documentary making, I met with a documentarian, and she said, you can't just make it just on your childhood. It needs to be something in the present that people can kind of walk through with you. Could be your advocacy work, because I was already speaking, doing other things at that point. So then for the MFA program, I submitted my materials and I was literally accepted. I actually have a letter accepting me. It was a conditional acceptance because they did want me to work more on my writing skills first. Well, when that was in the mail, I got an email from the person in charge of the program, and with it saying, well, we really can't accept this writing sample because you need newspaper articles, you need arrest records, you need something." And I took it really hard, and I took it that she didn't believe me. So, I told my husband I wanted to hire a private investigator, and I wanted him to find one because it was just so hard for me to do, and he took a couple of days on it, but then he said, "If we're gonna do this, we need to do all of it." And so this could cost like $50,000. And I thought, wow, with $50,000, I could write a personal documentary. And the next morning, I woke up with the idea of calling my documentary, Am I Crazy? My Journeys to Determine If My Memories Are True. So that's when I got started on that. And I kind of left the memoir writing. And then when I came back to it, the same essay I submitted as a writing sample is in my memoir. I'm also pleased in my memoir that I have trigger warnings on each essay. So that one has extremely high trigger warning, but most of my essays have low trigger warnings. So I've made them accessible to survivors who maybe don't want to read anything triggering. And my longest essay is How I Healed. So it is very much written with survivors in mind.
So you had said that when you started documentary filmmaking for Am I Crazy, which I just watched and it's excellent. So thank you for your creative process there. You were wanting to ensure that your memories were true. It seemed as if, from a viewer's perspective, that as you did these interviews with people like leaders in the False Memory Foundation or Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who all kind of were against the idea of recovered memory, that you were very clear that your memories were true. You were very grounded in it. And something that I loved in watching those interactions was that you never faltered. You didn't doubt yourself. You were so clear about where you stood, and they looked ridiculous. The things that they said were ridiculous or added to the pro incest movement, which we know is so much more common than people want to admit. And it was so beautiful that you kind of were this rock, and then they just made themselves look so silly. So I'm surprised to hear you say that you were actually kind of questioning yourself. And I'm curious what you think about that.
I questioned myself before had my first interview, and I did so by the people who promote the idea, the really ridiculous idea of false memories. I mean, memories is faulty, so that's true, but recovered memories are no more faulty than continuous memories, and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk says they are less faulty. But anyway, they say that if you read a book, the book will influence you to think you were abused as a child. Well, if that's the case, then reading books that they promote would do the opposite. That was my reasoning. So for 6 weeks, I only read books that were written by proponents of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Mm.
I mean, I spent 6 weeks of my life doing that. So I took that time, and during that time of only reading those books, one of the things that I just found so disgusting was the same people who were saying memories like mine were false were saying that child abuse isn't that bad.
Right.
And in those books, I mean, they would be like, "Oh, child abuse, it didn't really hurt kids that much." So I was pleased that I got someone on camera saying that. First interview was with Pam Fried, the founder of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And yes, I was really nervous about that interview because I thought she's going to ask me some question I've never thought of. And I am going to go, oh, well, maybe these memories aren't true. And I thought that walking into the interview. But another thing that happened for me is that I was discounting specifically abuse by my mother, sexual abuse by my mother. And I absolutely could not sleep at night for the week before the interview. It was like, "Oh, I'm not gonna talk about that. Maybe it's not true." And then I'd have this pain. I'd have a body memory of something my mother did to me, and I was like I absolutely couldn't go to sleep until I just went, "Yeah, it is true." And then I went to sleep. I mean, it was my body was just really upset with the idea that I was gonna say it wasn't true. But it made sense because when I went to see Pam Fried, I thought that I could convince her my memories were true, and then, she'd dismantle her organization, and she'd start being nice to her own daughter. Oh, I feel very sure she thought she could convince me that my memories weren't true, and she really set out to do that during the interview. She tried to convince me that my memories weren't true. Her husband was actually there, and he talked to me about how unreliable hypnosis is, and and I had survivors come to me and say, "Don't put that hypnosis in because you're gonna be discounted because you had hypnosis." And I'm like, "No, I'm gonna put it in because the reason I'm doing it is so that people can watch it who are being discounted." My next interview, I went into it questioning it some. What he said was so ridiculous that a child under 3 will not be affected by trauma. I know I didn't question it after that, and by the time I went to see Dr. Loftus, I was in no way questioning my memories.
It's
Um,
so relieving to me to hear that and engaging with these people who worked really hard to refute stories like yours, stories like mine, stories like other incest survivors or other types of people who have recovered memories after trauma, that it really that their lack of convincing arguments or evidence-based research or their pro-incest propaganda, whatever else it was, really made you more confident in yourself and in your memory. But it's so sad to think that these people and this organization had such authority over the psychological community, over our society in the 90s, so much so that it really repressed what was an anti-incest movement that was being born of the second wave of feminism in the 70s, that the False Memory Syndrome Foundation had so much influence, and yet the things they had to say were so ridiculous. I mean, it's, like, shocking to me when I watched your film, thinking these people had more authority because that's what I read about in the psychological books of the 1980s and 90s, and then listening to you interview them and be like, "Who would ever believe these goofballs?"
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I agree. I think for me, it serves some of the same purpose as confronting my parents who were deceased by the time I made the film. So confrontation can sometimes be helpful, but I don't really it sometimes can be really hurtful too. So I'm really pleased I have the film so people can see them and they can get some of what I got without going through that. And I would never go through that again. That was horrible, those interviews. I would never go through anything like that again.
How did you take care of yourself while you were reading all these books about false memory and doing these interviews with these people who most of them had been accused of harming children sexually? How did you nourish your nervous system and sustain the labor to get through that?
Probably not as well as I wish I had. I remember eating some good food in Philadelphia. My husband came with me, we did some sightseeing. The other thing I'll say is that Lynn Crook was very helpful to me during that process. This is her book, False Memories: The Deception That Silenced Millions. Lynn Crook was really a victim of Loftus. Lynn won a civil lawsuit against her parents. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus testified for her parents. The judge was not impressed with Dr. Loftus's arguments and with the other False Memory Syndrome Foundation proponent who testified in that trial. But then Loftus lied about Lynn's case to the media. Well, that's not okay. So Lynn's book, she has so much information in this book, so many details, and the real story of the FMSF is in that book. I write a little bit about it in my memoir. I have one chapter on my encounters with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which tell a little bit more of the backstory of some of these interviews I had for my film.
So much of what I want this interview to do is to encourage viewers to watch your film, Am I Crazy or Mothers of Molestation, where they can get all of the context behind everything that we're talking about. One of the things that I really love that you did in both your films is you brought in the stories of other survivors, like Lynn Crook, as you said. Marilyn Van de Buren was another example of people who were coming out at that time very publicly about a history of child sexual abuse and recovered memory. And I'm so in awe. This is what I see so frequently when I encounter stories like yours. I call you all like the matriarchs of the anti incest movement or the mothers of the anti incest movement, you and Marilyn and Laura Davis and Donna Jensen and Eve Ensler, who now goes by V. This whole community of activists who were directly confronting these lies that were so easily believed by society, and this institutional betrayal that incest survivors experience at every level. We experience it at the family level, and then we experience that in the criminal legal system, and we experience it from our friends and from our communities and from our partners. There's all of these patterns, and yet the resilience of each of you is like astounding to read about, to watch, to listen as a younger survivor. My generation of survivors has so much to learn from you all, but also so much to thank you for, that the sacrifice and the fight that you all endured so that we could have a little bit more space to help solve this problem is really important.
Thank you. I benefited from the support that came in the '80s and, early '90s. I remembered in 1993, I did have that help, and it was when the women were becoming more liberated, and then people were speaking out about their childhoods. But the other thing I think this is real important to say is I didn't speak out until I was really ready. I did not speak out while my children were young. I did not speak out when I was dependent on my social work income. I wondered if by speaking out, how that would have affected me.
It's such an interesting experience for me to listen to other survivors who have recovered memory, just in the process of we recover our memory and then we have to learn to believe ourselves, and that is a different process for all of us. And then we all integrate healing into our lives. I really believe healing is a lifestyle for people who have had developmental trauma or have been serially abused. And then some of us choose to step forward. And you said that you didn't do that until you were ready. What made you feel ready? What was that like for you?
Well, I had to leave my marriage, my first marriage, which was 23 years. My ex-husband silenced me in many ways. It was verbally abusive marriage. It was which is domestic violence. When I got out of the marriage, yeah, I mean, I'd taken a really huge step and I just kept taking them. I flew to Denver and confronted my father. I felt very much my mother being my cheerleader in the process. So my mother was dead, and I really felt her in her whatever state she's in telling me, "You go and confront," and I did. And so I really I had severe chronic pain at the time. I really didn't really know how I was gonna support myself, but I did get spousal support for 5 years, and I was pretty courageous to just, go, "This is how I wanna live my life, and I'm gonna do it." When I was 40, I took a creativity class, and it changed my life in that it got me thinking toward what is my creative purpose, and so I wrote a screenplay. I made my first movie for fun. It was just something I just so wanted to do. Yeah, I started taking some risk and living my life how I wanted to. And then after I got married and have the financial security, then I took 13 years off and my husband supported me while I did my films and book. Then when I finished those, I'm like, I can go back to social work now. And so that's a part of my life also.
That's something that I love to listen for in our community of incest survivors is how creative we are, how liberative we are. We're all such liberators because we've had to work so hard to both survive and then liberate ourselves. And it's so fun to witness, like you said, how our creativity is born, like throughout our liberation journeys, and then how we come to share that. One of the things you talk about in both of your films, and as well as a main focus of your book, is this message that your life is so good now. Do you want to talk a little bit about the message of hope that you have to give survivors after a really difficult journey?
I do because that's what I like to be a source of hope to survivors like I was starting out. And one thing I had going for me that really helped me was I had relatives. I had 4 relatives who remembered before I did, and so those were people I could call when I wanted some support or I wanted to confirm memories I had. I feel like what I'm doing now is helping people in the same ways I was helped by these relatives, because often, very often, there's only one survivor, one person in a huge family system who's willing to go public, or who's willing to acknowledge what happened. But as far as my life now, I think one thing for survivors to do is go ahead and draw pictures and write down your eventual goals. And I have so many of them now in my life. I'm married to someone who's very helpful and supportive and who's honest. He's almost honest to a fault, but that's so good to be married to someone with integrity. And I have a house with a view. I love views. And I have children in my life a lot. I do psychotherapy with children, and I also babysit a child that lives in the neighborhood. Yesterday, she and I made a video together. We made a video on how to make paintbrush people, this craft, so you can see that on my YouTube. I just have a nice balance in my life and one I really enjoy. So, it's dreams that, have come true for me, living in a beautiful area. So, yeah, I really want to be a source of hope, but the other thing I want people to know is it takes time, and you can see I have gray hair, it's taken a long time to get here, and so don't use the fact that I have a good life now against yourself. Don't say, "Well, she's got a good life and I don't. I'm doing something wrong." No, it took a long time to work toward this. So anything you do toward your healing is your part-time job and is a part-time job that will eventually pay off. When I started thinking of my healing as my part-time job, it reduced my stress so that I could, at the end of the day, instead of going, I haven't gotten much done, I could say, I spent 4 hours today on meditation, walking, yoga, and other forms of healing. And so it's like, yeah, that was my part-time job. I did it well today. So I love to encourage survivors. And in my book, my How I Healed essay has just lots of really specific ideas about how I healed and that hopefully is encouraging. I have another essay, The Magic of Creativity, and I tell about my creative process.
I think that's so important, this kind of peer-to-peer support network or these systems of solidarity that we're building to really validate each other, encourage each other when so much of the world is telling us the opposite, that we can say, no, your memories are real, your experience is real. I can really relate to what you're going through, and I can care for you and with you through this journey. Something I loved about your films is that we're not just recovering our individual memory, we're recovering collective memory. That there's so many of us who have been abused, who have lost memory, recovered it, and then continue to be silenced by various systems, people, etc., that it's made it very difficult for our movement throughout history to sustain itself. We see these waves of an anti-incest movement throughout history, and something that we see in other liberation historical movements is that reclaiming a shared history, a collective history, and knowing your history, knowing where you came from, or why our community has been so repressed and oppressed and silenced, can give us so much strength as a community. So something that I think your films do so beautifully is it doesn't just share your history, it shares our history as an anti-incest movement, particularly in the 80s and 90s, both the resilience of survivor stories and the community that you were all building, as well as the backlash that had such a impact on why incest as a word now was not used at all in my generation as a survivor.
My website, maryknightproductions.com, has all my films, it has my book. My last name is spelled Knight, like knight in shining armor, maryknightproductions.com. Welcome also to email me, maryknighthappy@yahoo.com. And I do have a YouTube channel. I have almost 7,000 subscribers, so get on it and you can subscribe. I also have a playlist, Recovered True Memories. I'm interviewing people who have recovered memories and then making clips. I have 25 people so far, so my goal is to have 100. So I'm glad to interview you if you have a recovered memory and you're willing to go public to the extent of having your face on video. It's fine to use a different name, no problem on that, but to have your face and your voice on video. I have Facebook, and I do a little bit on TikTok, a little bit on Twitter, and a little bit on Instagram.
Well, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to speak with you today. Really appreciate your work and your courage and resilience in coming forward so that we can keep building our movement to ensure that the next generation of children are safe and that survivors are supported.
Thank you.